Thank you all for coming. So, to start off, we're just going to get grounded, and we're going to talk a little bit about the political spectrum. First of all, take it from the top. The worst mistake we can make is to think that, oh, everything in Israel is hunky-dory, it's perfect, it's white as the driven snow. But it's almost equally ridiculous to say, oh, no, there's a good Israel and there's a bad Israel. And if, only it's 50-50, it's right down the middle, and, if only the soul of Israel will survive. If only Benjamin Netanyahu is pushed out of power, that's the bad Israel, But Yair Lapid, the gelled-haired, carbon copy of him, he's the good Israel. If only we can replace him with that, and everything will be better, okay? Both of these are ridiculous concepts. First of all, to begin with, they served together in the exact same government a decade ago. And more to the point, there's dozens of parties running for Knesset, for the Israeli parliament, and a dozen parties get into the Knesset. So let's make it a little simpler for folks to get a sense of what's really going down on the ground. The way that we can understand Jewish political thought is by asking the question, how do folks feel about the Torah, the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew sacred texts? And the questions that we ask are, is the Torah holy? And is it just? So is the Torah written by Jehovah, by Yahweh, by God? And is it just? Is it legitimate? Is it correct when it says that this God gave the land of Israel, Palestine, to the Jewish people as a piece of property? So what we find is that there are multiple positions. In the last 150 years, we see a whole spectrum of views in the Jewish community, and the first one we'll start with is the traditional Orthodox view. I call it anyways, the supremacist camp. And they would say yes and yes to both of these questions. Yes, the Torah is holy. Yes, it's written by God. And yes, it's just. It's correct when it says that God gave the Jewish people are the chosen people by God, and this land is for them. The next camp, we can call it the Reformist camp. They would say yes and no. Yes, the Torah is holy. These texts are holy. But no, it's not just when it says that we are chosen amongst others and that this land is only for us. No, we need to amend it, and we need to correct it, and we need to change it, and we need to bring the Torah texts in line with our modern day values. So that's the Reformist camp. Then there's the opportunist camp. This is the traditional, the nationalist or the Zionist camp, what we'd call secular Zionism. And they would say the opposite. They'd say no and yes. No, the Torah is not holy. Of course not. It was written by people and edited by other people in different periods of time. And it's literature. The British have Shakespeare and we've got the Torah. But yes, it is just when it says that this land belongs to the Jewish people. So no, there is no God, but yes, God gave us the land. So that's and that's why I call them the opportunist camp. The next camp, I would call it the Humanist camp, or the Socialist camp, and they would say no and no to those questions. No, the Torah is not holy. It's written by people. It doesn't have any extra added value to it. And then there's no, this is not just. It is not right that the Jewish people are chosen more than any other, or that they have more rights to this land than anyone else. So those are the four camps, we can say, and we can take all the political parties in the Knesset and kind of divide them into these camps. So we could analyze the spectrum by looking, as I said, how they view the Torah, the holy texts, but we could also use the same spectrum to in a different manner. We can say, well, how do they see the indigenous people of Palestine? How do they see the others, the non-Jews that they live amongst? So we would say that there's the humanist camp. We call it the integration camp. They want a one-state democracy, one state from the river to the sea, where everyone has equal rights. Then there's the separation camp. They want two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state, for Palestine to be partitioned. Then there's the domination camp. They want an apartheid state, one state from the river to the sea, with Jews having more rights than non-Jews. And then there's the elimination camp, and they want that one state from the river to the sea to be ethnically cleansed of non-Jews. another framework besides these. We can say there's, we can go to the first framework, to the Torah. We can go to also the typical political labels that we are accustomed to here in North America. We could say, okay, the socialist camp, the liberal camp, the nationalist camp, and the theocratic camp. It's pretty much the same thing, and whichever will help you better understand the spectrum of political thought. Just to bring you back to the Israeli Knesset, in Israel, because it is the national project, so the nationalist camp is the biggest camp. By far, it's the largest camp, the largest voting bloc in the Knesset. So we can, maybe for argument's sake, we can divide it into labor and revisionist or left and right, but it's the same nationalist camp that supports one apartheid state. Maybe one is prouder of it and the other one's a little bit more embarrassed about it and tries to cover it up, but it's the same nationalist camp. Now, when we look at all the elections for the Israeli Knesset in the last 2 decades, let's say from 2000 to 2020, in those 8 elections, if you look at how the parties performed in those elections, you can't make heads or tails of it. It seems like the fortunes of the parties rise and fall, and you can't really make out any system or any pattern here. But I would argue that if you take those political parties and then funnel them into the political camps, the 4-camp schema that I just described, then all of a sudden you find that there's incredible consistency, that there are almost no changes from election to election to election. The Israeli electorate continues to perform in the same way or to vote in the same way. Consistently, the domination camp, the apartheid camp, is the largest camp by far. As I said, we're talking 60+% of the vote. And the second largest camp is the elimination camp, with about 20-odd% of the electorate. So the domination camp in the driver's seat and the elimination camp in the sidecar, in the shotgun position. Structured in one way, so you can see this is consistently, again and again, this is the Israeli political spectrum, time and time again, for the last 20 years. When we map it onto the parliament, where there are 120 seats, this is what it looks like, all right? From left to right, again and again, vote after vote, year after year, we see the same structure. Now, we bring it up to the present, and here we are. If you notice that this is the current parliament, it's sitting in Israel right now. Now notice when I go back 20 years, it's almost identical. It's literally almost the same, right? So once you have a Knesset, then you have to form a government. You have to create a majority of seats to put a prime minister in power. And what we see is that consistently it's the domination camp, or one of the parties, one of the largest parties in the domination camp that is in the driver's seat, coupled with some of the elimination camp parties. So this is what the governments look like, again and again, whether it's the right domination or the left domination, but consistently, it's the same pattern. Now, until 2019, at that point, Netanyahu's in power, he's got the entire right-wing bloc, but then he's up on corruption charges, massive corruption charges. And so now there's a big question in Israel. Who do we hate more, Arabs or Netanyahu? And at this point, because of his endemic corruption, even the nationalist camp starts to peel away from him. And so with the loss of some of his most natural allies, it's now borderline. Who can form the government? Will it be the Netanyahu camp or the other nationalists? And so we have election after election and nothing is decided. And then finally, even one of the eliminationist parties, the religious parties, abandons Netanyahu. And because of that, they now hold the balance of power and they can help form an alternative government. And that's what we have now. So for the first time in Israel's history, we have a prime minister from the elimination camp, from the religious parties. That's Naftali Bennett. According to him, when he took over the prime minister seat, he described his new government as 10 degrees more right-wing than the Netanyahu government. So this is what we can expect in the years to come, for as long as he's in power. We'll see how long that lasts. Not too long by my estimation. In any case, one of the other effects, one of the other developments to come out of this last election cycle was the introduction of a new camp that hasn't been seen in the Knesset for the last 33 years. And I call this camp the Messianist camp, or the monarchist camp, we can say. And what they want is not only to ethnically cleanse the country, but they also want to expand it. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So in a way, the monarchist camp is a combination of a bastard child, we could say, of the nationalist and the theocratic camp. Now, this is what I mean. So both of these nationalist and theocratic camps, they're both right-wing camps, but at the same time, each of them has like a safety valve to prevent them from going full-blown, psychosis. So let's say the nationalists. I mean, these are the people that committed the Nakba and the Naksa. They are expansion. They are about the apartheid state, about creating and implementing the apartheid state. But at least they're secular, so their discourse is based in rational arguments. You don't agree with their arguments, you can argue with them, but at least you can have an argument with them on a rational basis. That's their release valve, so to speak. When we look at the theocratic camp, their vision for the state is they want no non-Jews in the country. It's completely off the walls and revolting, but because traditionally they are pacifists, they don't believe that this eliminationist vision that they want to bring into being will come through their own handiwork. They believe that it is from God, that God will create this state of affairs. It's min Allah. So therefore, that's their safety valve. As horrific as their vision is, they're not implementing it by force. You can have a conversation with them. But the monarchist camp or the Messianist camp, they combine the worst aspects of these two right-wing camps, and there's no safety valve. And they just want to push Palestinians out, and they want to do it by their own hand. They want to not only eliminate the non-Jews, they want to exterminate the non-Jews, and they want to expand the country well beyond its borders. Not just the West Bank and Gaza, they want Lebanon, they want Iraq, Iran, Turkey, etc., etc. So what we can say is the most dominant personality in the Messianic camp in Israeli history, the founding father, you could say, of the Israeli Messianist camp is Meir Kahana, an American-born rabbi, came up here in New York. And it's not difficult to understand what his ideology is. You can just read his magnum opus, The Jewish Idea. It's a bit long, so you might want to just go for one of the other books he wrote, They Must Go. There's not really mincing his words here. He's just saying straight up, they must go, straight up ethnic cleansing. But beyond that, here's just a couple of choice quotes so you can get a sense of the ideology that that his followers imbibed from him. When I'm prime minister, no Arab will be hurt by Jewish terrorism because there won't be an Arab left in Israel. Here's another ditty. I want to remove the Arabs from Israel because I do not want to kill them every week. Or how about this one? They will come to me, bow to me, lick my feet, and I will be merciful and will allow them to leave. Whoever does not leave will be slaughtered. So this is Kahanism, okay? There's no bones about it. This is where we're at. Now, admittedly, when Kahana, and of course, he now has legions of followers. People took to his vision. Now, the thing about Kahana and Kahanism is it's most dangerous dafka when there's a chance for peace. Exactly when maybe Israel will steer off the path of permanent apartheid, that's when they're most dangerous. When there's a thought that maybe they won't continue, it's the right word, lurch to the right, that's when they pull out the big guns. And we see this consistently time and time again in the late 70s, 1980s, when Egypt and Israel buried the hatchet, made a peace deal between Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin. That's when the Kahanists implemented the plan, and they plotted to blow up the Dome of the Rock, the Haram al-Sharif in the old city of Jerusalem, the most beautiful building in Palestine, one of the most important Muslim shrines in the country and in the world. So Kahana sat in jail for 6 months for plotting to blow it up, and the hope was that by destroying it, this would cause a religious war between Jews and 1 billion Muslims all over the world, and there would be no more chance for peace, and that would be it, back to permanent war. And this is like a pattern that they repeated again and again. Now, if you can imagine, after this, after he plotted and sat in jail for wanting to blow up the Dome of the Rock, he was then elected to the Knesset. Now, when he was elected to the Knesset, we found something interesting. At that point, Israeli society was still not comfortable with Kahana, in the main. And so when he would come up and speak in front of the assembly, members of the ruling party would walk out. Even the right-wing Likud party, its members would walk out of the Knesset plenum because they just couldn't countenance his open, unabashed racism. It was just too much for them. That's where Israeli society was in the 1980s. And eventually, he was turfed out of the Knesset. The Knesset passed a law that said a party that espouses racism as part of its ideology cannot stand for election. And so he was no longer able to run for the Knesset. But of course, as I said, he had legions of followers. Soon afterwards, one of those followers from his party, Baruch Goldstein, as you may know, again, with the same idea of trying to prevent any possibility of peace when in the early 1990s you had the Oslo peace process for good and bad. We can talk about that later, but at least it was an attempt to try to end decades of war and ethnic cleansing between, and fierce hatred between Israelis and Palestinians. So when this happened, when there was a possibility of peace, that's when Baruch Goldstein and the Kahanists stepped up. And Goldstein went into, again, one of the most important places for Jews and for Muslims, the holy shrine in Khalil, in Hebron. And at this, the Cave of the Patriarchs, he came in and he massacred the biggest mass murder in Israeli history. He murdered 29 Palestinians and wounded over 100. Now, Goldstein was just one Kahanist killer. There's been dozens of Kahanist killers, over 20 at least. He had the biggest death count, but many have that record. But what was most powerful about Goldstein's massacre, not only did he have the highest death toll, but he succeeded in killing Oslo, because 40 days after this horrific massacre, exactly 40 days, which is the Muslim mourning period, the Arba'in, exactly 40 days later, that's when Hamas began for the first time its suicide bombing campaign in 48 Israel, exactly 40 days later. And that, of course, for Israelis, that was the end of it. They wouldn't imagine the possibility of peace after these suicide bombs. So he succeeded. The Kahanists succeeded in doing what they wanted to. Now, Kahana himself was killed in New York in 1990. After he passed, the reins were passed over to his son, Binyamin Kahana. Now, I'm going to now explain to you what happened to the rest of Kahana's followers. Did they die in obscurity? Did they scuttle into the corner? No, just the opposite. They went on to take over the reins of power. And this is what I mean by that. So, first of all, as I said, Kahana died. His son Binyamin took over. Now, Binyamin wasn't really as, let's just say, he wasn't really a man's man. He wasn't able to stir up the emotions of people. He wasn't the incredible figure his father was. So behind the scenes, the person who was really running the show was another longtime Kahanist who had also moved from New York, Mike Guzovsky. All right, so after Baruch Goldstein's massacre in Hebron, Guzovsky said of Baruch Goldstein, he was the sweetest Jew who ever lived. So you can get a sense of who this guy is. Now, in the wake of this, all right, we have, again, the Kahanists are doing everything they can to try to end the Oslo Accords, to try to blow it up. Guzovsky was the spearhead of an effort by Kahanists to essentially start a settler army, a militia of their own that could wage war on the Palestinians. If the Israeli army wasn't going to do it, then the Kahanists were going to do it. And they made plans to import arms and even tanks, if you can imagine this. Of course, the Shin Bet realized what was happening and they prevented him. But this was their plan, that they were going to wage full-on war with armaments. Guzovsky was not able to bring in the cache of weapons that he wanted to. And so what he did next was he decided to train dogs, to breed dogs that would, because he wasn't able to bring weapons into the country, but he could bring vicious dogs in. So they acquire dogs, and now he breeds dogs. And if you'd believe it, these dogs patrol areas around the settlements in order to expand the land that settlers sit on, in order to make Palestinians fear just being able to walk outside their village and to graze with their sheep and to farm their fields. So this is Guzovsky. And in recent years, we have the state of Israel officially adopting Guzovsky and folding his patrols, his canine patrols, into the Israeli army. So you have joint patrols with the Israeli army. So now the Kahanist has been totally normalized with Israeli security forces. Guzovsky went on to be a town councillor in the Kahanist stronghold of Tapuach. And as you can see, the Israeli media treats him like a darling, like he's some kind of hero for his canine patrols. So this is how the Kahanists are whitewashed in the media. Now, move on to another figure you may not have heard of, or maybe you have. This is Kahana's yeshiva, the religious ceremony that he founded in Jerusalem. And amongst his prime pupils that came out of this school was, I don't know if you recognize, anyone in the audience recognize? Yes, it is. This is none other than Benzi Gopstein. Here's a photo of him in his youth before he grew his trademark beard. But you're absolutely right. This is Benzi Gopstein. Now, when Kana was assassinated on the streets of New York City in 1990, that very night, Gopstein went out and allegedly he and other Kahanists murdered two Palestinians as retribution, for Kahana's killing. So, he should have been behind bars for the rest of his life, but the police were not able to put together a strong case against him, so he got out. He was released soon after. Now, part of the reason that he was able to be released, first of all, just to give you a sense of who this guy is, so you understand he hasn't gone too far off the mark. He's still solid Kahanist. In answer to the direct question, he was asked by a group of rabbis, "Are you in favor of burning churches in the land of Israel? Yes or no?" Gopstein answers, "You have to burn. Yes, of course. Simply yes. Why are you even asking? You have any doubt?" So this is the same Gopstein. He hasn't changed minutia. And as I said, he suspected of these murders back then. And today, he's training the next generation of Israeli youth, of Kahanist youth. This is the Lehava, the anti-miscegenation squad that patrols Israeli cities that he heads. And of course, whenever they find Jews and Palestinians talking to one another, socializing together, they harass them and harangue them. More often, when they see a Palestinian in, let's say, West Jerusalem, or a place they want to ethnically cleanse of non-Jews, they will walk up to someone and say, "Hey, Masha, yesh lecha sigaria?" They'll ask them a simple question: "What time is it? Can I have a cigarette?" Just to hear how they answer, to hear, do they have an Arabic accent? Because there's no way to know if someone's Jewish or not. But once they hear that you speak Hebrew with an Arabic accent, okay, now we know. Boom. And that's when they attack. So this is Lehava, this is Gopstein, this is what we've come to. Now, the way that Gopstein was able to get away with what he'd done back in the day was because of another prime pupil of Kahana, also in this photo, David Ivri. To get a sense of who this guy is, who, according to police suspicions, he hid the evidence. He hid the evidence of Gopstein's murders, and that's how he was able to get off. So that's what we have him to thank for. Now, of course, Ivri has gone on, continues in the years that followed to be a loyal Kahanist, preaching at his memorial services. But it's really instructive to see even how he sees Israeli society, Jewish Israeli society. So, of course, we talked earlier about Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli prime minister from the nationalist camp, but one who attempted to cut a peace deal with the Palestinians in the early 1990s. Remember, Kahanists incited against Rabin, and eventually someone was moved by that incitement enough to assassinate Rabin. And after he was assassinated, according to David Ivri, we drank a cup of alcohol, l'chaim. That's how we carried on with the day, like a small Purim. It's a Jewish holiday, a celebratory holiday. Everybody gets what's coming to them. It was not a Jew who was murdered. It was a traitor who was liquidated. The liquidation of an enemy is a positive thing. So these were his public statements. And what's happened today to David Ivri? He is an Israeli diplomat. He is sent to European Congress, to the American Congress, to speak on behalf of the settler movement and negotiate political alliances between the Israeli far right and the European and American far right. So this is how he's been whitewashed. Okay. Let's move on to the religious side of the spectrum. All right. Now, as we understand, as I explained, that religious society in Israel is very much indebted to their rabbinical leaders, and they have a huge amount of sway in their community. The most revered rabbis, and probably the most revered of all, is this man, Ovadia Yosef, just to give you a sense of how important this rabbi is in Israeli society. He's now passed. He died a few years ago. When he died, his funeral was the largest in Israeli history. Hundreds of thousands of people attended. It was massive. And just so you, again, an insight into what moves him, he said, Gentiles, non-Jews, were born only to serve us. Without that, they have no place in the world, only to serve the Jewish people. This is Ovadia Yosef. Why are Gentiles needed? They'll work, they'll plow, they'll reap. We will sit like an effendi and eat. This is Israel's number one rabbi. A real brainiac here. Okay, so that's Ovadia Yosef. But, of course, he sired essentially a dynasty. He was the chief rabbi of Israel. Now his son is the chief rabbi of Israel. And he spawned a whole host of, and beyond that, beyond just being, occupying the chief rabbinate, his followers also founded a political party in Israel to take that religious power and convert it into political power. And so they started the Shas party. And one of the first members of Knesset to represent the Shas party in the Knesset was Ovadia's son, Yaakov Yosef. But unlike his father, he didn't believe in waiting for some messianic age to bring about his eliminationist ideology. He wanted to do it right now. And so in the Knesset, one of the things that he's most remembered for is stripping anti-racist laws of any heft. So, of course, as I said earlier, once Kahana became an impactful voice in Israeli society, the Knesset tried to pass a law that would make it illegal to incite racism. Okay? And in fact, they did pass this law and making it illegal to incite racism. But Yaakov Yosef worked to make sure that Kahana would still be able to. What he did was he tinkered with the law so that there was a loophole in it. And the loophole said, well, if you're justifying this racism that you're inciting by predicating it on religious arguments, then it's okay, you have an exemption. As long as you have a religious argument to support your racist argument, then you get by, you aren't punished for your incitement. So that we can thank Yaakov Yosef for. Another classic example, he was one of the rabbis who openly endorsed the King's Torah, a book that came out about a decade ago. This book, it's essentially, as Max has written about, essentially a Gentile baby murdering manual, I'm sad to say. Amongst the texts, here's a quote from the book, for example. There is justification for killing babies if it is clear that they will grow up to harm us. Okay? Now, these aren't only words on paper. These words have effect. The reason they write these words is so that people can carry them out, and that's what happens. That's what happened in the village of Duma, when followers of the Kahana movement firebombed the house of a family and burnt to death in their beds, father, mother, and one-year-old baby, the Dawabshe family. All right? So this is Yaakov Yosef, and he's loved and praised and held up as a hero in his community. He's not marginalized. So he's a classic Kahanist, sure, and that shows the symmetry and the synthesis between the Kahanists and the Shas party. But now it's out in the open. If before it was masked, now the mask has fallen. So with his son, all right, now the grandson of Ovadia Yosef. So we're now 3 generations of ultra-racists. And the grandson, Yonatan Yosef, well, he's got a backstory. I should probably tell the backstory, how he came into the movement. It was probably instructive. So when he was just 18 years old, at that point, Israel founded for the first time an ultra-Orthodox army unit. As I explained earlier, the ultra-Orthodox prefer not to engage in the dirty work of oppressing Palestinians. They prefer to remain in the yeshiva and the religious seminary and study Torah and Talmud. But at that point, we're talking 22 years ago, the Israeli government decided we're going to start one ultra-Orthodox unit of the army. So at that point, Yonatan Yosef, he didn't serve in it, but he had friends in it, and he arranged with them to smuggle weapons out of the army, and they collected caches of weapons, and they plotted to murder Palestinians. And he was arrested in the Kahanist yeshiva, where he was living, the Kahanist religious seminary in Jerusalem, arrested there, and he would have been put away for a long time, but Kahana's replacement in the Knesset, an advocate of ethnic cleansing that replaced him, Rechavam Ze'evi, was a minister in the government at that time, and he heard word from the Shin Bet that they were going to come and arrest Yonatan Yosef, so he gave him a phone call to give him a heads up. Watch out, they're coming to arrest you. Hide all the ammunition that you've been storing. And so he was able to, get it out of his room in time so that when the cops came to arrest him, they didn't find all the evidence that they could have. And so he actually got off really easy. Of course, today, you may know Yonatan Yosef as Jerusalem city councilor. This is a city councilor of Al-Quds, okay? You may, and of course you've seen him on video, right? You've heard him speaking. We take house after house, talking about the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem, of course. All of this area will be a Jewish neighborhood. We are not finished the job. We are going to the next neighborhood, and after that we'll go more. Is it at the Arabs' expense? Yes. This is Yonatan Yosef, and this is his henchman, Yaakov Fauci. I'm sure you remember him. He's the one living in the Al-Kurd family home in Sheikh Jarrah. So this is Yonatan Yosef. Now, it's not bad enough that we have one Kahanist city councilor. We've actually got at least 2. His partner in crime, also not just a city councilor, but the deputy mayor of Jerusalem, if you could imagine this, Arya King. And he's even worse. Arya King, in 2014, in the summer of 2014, he stood, this is a photograph of him at that time, standing in front of a crowd of hundreds of ultra-Orthodox men, and he tells them, this Sabbath, we will read about Zimri and Cosbi. Now, what is Zimri and Cosbi? It's a story in the Bible, and according to this legend, there was a Jewish man and a Midianite woman. In other words, it was an interracial relationship. And this priest, Phineas, was so incensed, so disgusted at this miscegenation, at this interracial love, that he actually took a spear, according to legend, and he murdered them in the middle of the act of lovemaking. In fact, according to the Talmud, it says, well, okay, first of all, King continues, he explains what he's talking about so there's no people in the audience who wouldn't know what he means. Phineas committed the act. He was zealous for God. And according to the Talmud, what that act was, miracles were done for Phineas. His aim was through the penis of the man and the vagina of the woman. That he pierced them in their intertwined genitals. I can hardly think of a more revolting image to conjure. So this is the story he's telling. Remember the story of Zimri and Cosbi? Remember that? Phineas committed the act. He got up and committed the act. And it's not just like that in the times of the Bible. It's like that today. Every single person here is like a small Phineas. I call out to all the small Phineases here in the audience. I call on all of us to make a great commotion. Wake up. The Lubavitcher Rebbe is here with us. A greatly revered rabbi that died, but he's here with us right now. And I have no doubt he expects us all to commit acts of Phineas, to commit acts of murder and mutilation. And like I said, it's not only words. Hours later, religious Jews went out and they mutilated and murdered a Palestinian teenager in Shofat, Muhammad Abu Khder. They kidnapped him from outside his home. And they stuffed him into a car and they drove him out to the forest and they forced petrol down his throat and they burned him to death from the inside out. That's Aryeh King. That's the deputy mayor of Jerusalem. Now, okay, no shocker, King is a Kahanist. We're horrified by the reemergence of the Kahana movement into prominence, but then when we look back, we realize, wait a second, they were there all along. Why didn't we notice this? In fact, for decades, they've been in Israel's ruling party. And by that I mean Moshe Feiglin. Now that the Kahanists are once again accepted into the Israeli mainstream, so now he doesn't mind coming out to the annual memorial services for Kahana and speaking there, where he's warmly greeted. And he speaks from the podium saying about that all the dear and good faces that I see here, they're old friends, they're mishpocha, meaning their family. This is my family, the Kahana movement. Talking about Kahana, he was right. What can you do? He was right. This is the slogan of the Kahana movement. Kahana was right. And he's declaring it openly. Coming out as a Kahanist. We're now in the phase when people are admitting their Kahanism all along. Rabbi Kahana was a man of truth. And with that truth, friends, we will win. Well, this Kahanist was brought into the Likud party. All right? Even in recent years, Netanyahu has doubled down on it and offered Moshe Feiglin ministerial positions in his government. So this isn't a marginal figure in any sense. Just a few years ago, he was the deputy speaker of the Knesset. It wasn't a real shocker. I mean, when we think about what he did once he was in that position, I mean, during the 2014 assault on Gaza, he was saying the IDF, the Israeli army, shall designate certain open areas in which the civilian population will be concentrated. Subsequent to the elimination, Gaza will become part of Israel and will be populated by Jews. So openly calling for more ethnic cleansing, for more conquest, for more murder. This is Feiglin. Feiglin, of course, he's really unabashed about his race hate here. He puts promotional videos out, when he's trying to win more adherents of him, kind of just like sampling popular Hollywood movies of Sparta and depicting him as slaying Palestinians, slaying the EU, killing the UN. This is the kinds of messages that he puts out. And in that position as deputy speaker, he was also inciting for Jews to go and take over Al-Aqsa, which is part of the Kahanist plot, as I explained, to take over the Al-Aqsa compound in East Jerusalem. So here is a flyer that he put out, purifying the place from land-thieving enemies of Israel and building the temple on the ruins of the mosques. We're talking again about the most beautiful building in the whole country. All right? And of course, this wasn't a one-off. Over the years, Kahanists have tried continuously to assault the Dome of the Rock and to blow it up. Yoel Lerner, Baruch Ben Yosef, Alan Goodman, Baruch Marzel, Israel Ariel, all of these men were arrested for that crime, stopped just before they could carry it out. Now, when I say to take over the Aqsa Mosque, let me explain what I mean so that it's 100% clear. We're talking about the Dome of the Rock, the Golden Dome. We're talking about the Silver Dome Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam. And they want to bulldoze the entire thing. And they want to build there a cubic temple, a temple/abattoir. And what I mean by that is that they plan to sacrifice animals there and for that to replace prayer worship. That no longer will Jews pray in synagogues, but instead they will go to the temple, and the temple priests will take animals and slaughter them and bring them up to the altar, and there they will cast the meat onto the flames, and the smoke will go up to heaven, and thus Yahweh will be satiated. And it's not 1, and it's not 10, and it's not 100. We're talking about 10,000 animals at a time on any odd Jewish holiday. So according to the Talmud texts, we're talking about priests being literally, quote, up to their knees in blood on Jewish holidays from the amount of blood, the amount of animal sacrifice that went on and that they want to repeat, that they want to bring back as part of the Jewish praxis. This is what they want to replace Al-Aqsa with. So if it was just marginal figures, voices in the desert that no one listens to, nicha. But we're talking about rabbis who receive the support of the Israeli government, of the chief rabbinate, of the Israeli Ministry of Education, of the Israeli Ministry of Culture. Israel Ariel, one of those men that plotted to take over the Al-Aqsa Mosque by force, he is now the chief rabbi of the Templar movement, as Dan Cohen can tell us, working on an important documentary about this topic. And Ariel was a Kahanist through and through. In fact, when Kahana ran for election, Israel Ariel was his number 2 on the Kach party candidates for Knesset. And when he comes to the mic, he just lets it rip. He just isn't embarrassed at all. He says straight up, we will conquer Iraq, Turkey. We will get to Iran too. Tell me this isn't true, Dan. We recorded him ourselves in speaking to his adherents. The mosques and the Christian spires and their crosses come down. If not, you kill all of their males by sword. You only leave the woman. And this man is on the Israeli government payroll. And he's calling to commit ethnic cleansing, not only in Israel-Palestine, but well beyond that. Now, of course, this is the event that we documented, him saying these frightening words. Also at that same event was another member of the Sanhedrin, of this religious council that they hope to take over and replace the ethnocracy that is Israel. And this man, Baruch ben Yosef, is one of those alleged assassins of Alex Aude that we talked about. According to the FBI, and I've interviewed multiple FBI agents on this on both coasts, and they confirm that in 1985, a group of Kahanists, including Ben Yosef, they went on a bombing run, and they bombed Arab American targets across the country. Of course, they damaged offices, and they badly wounded people, and they killed people, including Alex Aude, in October 1985. Now, after he got away with his bombing run, his murder streak, he then took another turn. He went to law school, if you can imagine that, and then he became a lawyer. And in fact, since that time, he has actually appeared in Israel's Supreme Court dozens of times arguing cases. And he's not the only Kahanist terrorist that has gone on to become an important lawyer, starting up lawfare organizations. We're also talking about Craig Leitner, who was part of a Kahanist terror cell that firebombed the Palestinian newspaper in East Jerusalem, Al-Fajr, that shot at a bus of Palestinians in the West Bank, just north of Ramallah, injuring 6-7 Palestinians in 1984. So Craig Leitner has a deep record of terrorism himself, and then he, like Baruch ben Yosef and like his wife, Nitzana, they went to Bar Ilan Law School, got their law degrees, and started lawfare organizations. Now, who would these Kahanist lawyers defend? Other Kahanist killers, of course. So basically, the first person that they really represented in court were the Amir brothers, Yigal Amir and his brother Chagai, the men who assassinated Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, inspired by the Kahanists to carry out this killing. So they were the lawyers who represented him in court after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. So since that time, they've gone on to start out what you may know as the Israel Law Center, or Shurat Hadin. And they have the audacity to claim that they are fighting terrorism, when in fact they were formed and founded by terrorists and funneling money to terrorists. Of course, that organization is buddy-buddy with the Israeli government. So we're not, again, talking about some marginal group, full-on folded into the Israeli legal apparatus. Baruch ben Yosef, the alleged assassin of Alex Saude, and Israel Fuchs, his partner in crime, also believed to have been one of those assassins. This is him today, and the two of them started up another lawfare organization, this one based right here in the US, called the ACCJ, the American Center for Civil Justice. This is a crazy name for a Kahanist lawfare organization, but over the years, Fuchs trained this man, became his protege. Over the course of many years in multiple organizations, he trained this lawyer. And if you can imagine this, they actually got all the way to the Knesset. They were sitting in meetings of Israeli Knesset committees, authoring legislation passed by the Israeli parliament, authored by these Kahanist lawfare groups. And now that protege of this Kahanist killer is sitting in the Israeli government. He's a member of the Knesset. Now that the Kahanists are in, he's in. And it's not only Simcha Rotman. So back to Baruch ben Yosef, the other alleged assassin of Alex Saude. So, he also spawned a protege. I don't know if you recognize them. This is an older photo of the two of them together. This is Itamar Ben-Gvir. He started out from his early days as a Kahanist. And in fact, a year after the Goldstein massacre, he dressed up as Goldstein, as an homage to him, And he said, for decades afterwards, he actually had a photograph of Goldstein on his living room wall with a picture of the Cave of the Patriarchs, the Ibrahimi Mosque in the background, and the minaret being toppled. He said, one day in a few decades, there'll be a Goldstein street. Baruch Goldstein will also be a hero. So, I should also point out that, of course, he was a big insider, one of those who confronted Rabin at every stretch of the game in his last days on earth. And he famously said on Israeli TV, without any shame, he jumped onto Rabin's motorcade and snatched the Cadillac symbol off. And he said, just as we got to this symbol, we can get to Rabin. And sure enough, days later, a Kahanist did so. Now, this is a little vignette just to give you a sense of how far Israeli society has shifted, right? Because that's what we're talking about, how things have changed, how far gone we are. So at that time, in this era, in the 1990s, Ben-Gvir is already becoming a media darling, and he's invited on to talk shows. This is a popular Israeli political talk show called Popolitika. So he comes on the show, and another guest on the panel was this man. He's the editor of a major Israeli newspaper. And again, a secular nationalist. At that point, Kahanism was hated by, polite society. And so he said to Ben-Gvir on the panel, "Little Itamar, that Nazi, shut your mouth, you dirty Nazi." Now, by any stretch of the imagination, that's an insult. So Itamar Ben-Gvir took him to court. How dare you call me a Nazi? How dare you defame me? And so, with the help of his teacher, Baruch ben Yosef, they took it to court. And they sued him. And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And it was a really, really interesting case. In the end, the Supreme Court said, well, look, admittedly, he did defame you. He called you a Nazi, and you're not a Nazi. On the other hand, Kahanism is pretty damn close to Nazism. We're talking about a hair's breadth away. So, all right, fair enough, we'll rule in your favor. He's guilty of libeling you, but the punishment will mete out to him will be only 1 shekel, which is the equivalent of an American quarter. So by this they were saying, okay, you're not a Nazi, but you're like Nazi adjacent, essentially. Now, this is back in the day, right? We're going back 2 decades to understand how they were framed back then. Today, that same newspaper, whose editor was sued by the Kahanists, that newspaper, Ma'ariv, publishes glowing interviews with Baruch ben Yosef, interview all about Haram al-Sharif and the Dome of the Rock and the temple that they want to build there on its ruins. And in this entire 45-minute interview, they don't once mention the fact that he tried to blow it up. You might think that would be a relevant factor. That's how far gone we are. The editor of the newspaper once called them a Nazi. Now they give them free license to whitewash their records and preach Al-Aqsa destructionism. That's where we are today. Now, this is the best they can do. Call him a right-wing activist. Someone who wants to genocide the non-Jews in the country. A right-wing activist. So, of course, Ben-Gvir learned well from him. Went on to, terrorize the local Palestinian population in Hebron where he lives. But he learned from Ben Yosef how to become a lawyer. He interned in his office. He did a stage with him in his law office. And now he's become a lawyer unto himself. And he's taken over a lot of Ben Yosef's casework, defending Kahanist killers, like the killers of the Dawabshe family, defending him in court, defending in court not just the murderers of the Dawabshe family, but those who celebrate the murders of the Dawabshe family, like these Kahanists at a wedding. If you can imagine this, here's Ben-Gvir, and here are the Kahanists holding up a photograph of 1-year-old baby Ali Dawabshe that they burned to death, and holding up a Molotov cocktail and stabbing the photo of Ali Dawabshe. This is how they celebrate their marriages in the Kahana movement. So these are the kinds of people that Ben-Gvir defends. But Ben-Gvir's biggest contribution, we can say, to the Israeli discourse, and how we can say he differs from Kahana, if there's a way that they differ, it's that he realized the loophole, what he needed to do to get around the legal framework that was foisted on Kahana to prevent his power base from actualizing his goals. And that is, you can't actually say, kill the Arabs. I mean, Mavet la'Aravim, death to the Arabs, is like very commonly heard amongst right-wingers when they're marching through East Jerusalem trying to drive Palestinians out. But when Ben-Gvir is in the mix, and I've heard this many times and I've recorded him many times doing this, when he hears a group of people, throngs of Kahanas screaming, death to the Arabs, he'll say, no, death to the terrorists. By changing the word, you can avoid being charged if you say death to the Arabs, it's not going to happen. The police aren't going to be too quick to do it, but there's a possibility that you could be charged. All you got to do is just say death to the terrorists, and everyone understands what you're talking about. So by just adding that little twist, he's able to fly under the radar. So instead of saying, he'll say expel the enemies, not don't expel the Palestinians, expel the enemies. And in this way, he is able to wiggle into the Israeli mainstream. And this is what he's done with the help of Netanyahu. As I mentioned, as long as Netanyahu was in power, he was driving the government full tilt to the far right. But when he came up on corruption charges, all of a sudden his power base started to shift beneath his feet, and it looked like he might lose his seat. And then he realized the only way to keep it, or he thought he might do so, was by re-mainstreaming the Kahana movement, bringing them into the Knesset, and that's what he did. And now the leader of the Kahanist party, the Jewish Power Party, Itamar Ben-Gvir, is a member of the Knesset. He too sits in the Knesset. And here's some of the Israeli political cartoonists, so it's not just in my imagination. And here's several story high poster, so you can see that they actually ran together. They actually co-promoted each other in the run-up to elections. They co-branded. And because their bases are very close. This is what we've come to, that the ruling Likud party has become Kahanist. It's not only the Moshe Feiglin faction. They've actually gobbled up the rest of the party as well. And so now this is our new reality. And now that he's in the Knesset, He has immunity. A Knesset member is able to get away with things that ordinary citizens aren't. And he uses that position in order to incite further violence and race wars. And again, it's not only the Likud party, because what we see now is not only the secular nationalists, but even the religious parties that traditionally made a pretense of being pacifists. Since Ben-Gvir was elected to the Knesset, you have the religious parties embracing him as well. Here is the leader of the United Torah Judaism Party. These are the religious, ultra-Orthodox Jews representing Northern European Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, hand in hand with Ben-Gvir. Here you have Aryeh Deri, the head of the Shas party, the party representing ultra-Orthodox Sephardi Jews, Jews from Southern Europe and from the Middle East, embracing Ben-Gvir. So the religious parties have fully welcomed him into the fold. The Kahana ideology is the driving force on the Israeli right, without question. And as I said, the Likud party itself is paying him utmost respect, coming out to his political events. He's the one leading them in the field, taking the fight to the front. Israeli ministers posing with him, paying him respects, showing him support publicly. And now he's using that to further incite race hatred, whether it's in Khalil, whether it's in Jerusalem, at Bab al-Amud, at the Damascus Gate, leading hundreds, thousands of right-wing Jews on a march to spit in the faces of the Palestinians living there, screaming death to the Arabs, going up on Haram al-Sharif, inciting Jews to go up there with the intention of eventually taking it over. And perhaps the most horrific, the Kahanist movement operating networks, social networks, where on WhatsApp and on Telegram and other platforms, they organize people to head into those few cities in Israel where it's not 99% Jews or 99% Palestinians, but those few cities where you actually have Jews and Palestinians living side by side, sending them to those areas and inciting race riots, inciting anti-Palestinian pogroms, planning them and distributing weapons so that they'll come stocked. According to Israel's police chief, what happened last May was that Ben-Gvir incited, in his words, a Jewish intifada. And the second last thing I'm going to show you is what that looked like. I know it's really difficult to look at, and I'm just giving you a heads up. It's not easy. But it's important that we look at this and not look away. This is what that looked like in practice. This is just south of liberal Tel Aviv, just south of Jaffa, okay? In the city of Bat Yam, just down the coast. Picturesque town on the Mediterranean. And Kahanists and other far-right Israelis swarmed the area in last May, and they just attacked any place of business that they suspected might be owned by a Palestinian person, or where there might be Palestinian people working. Whether it was a shawarma restaurant or whether it's an ice cream store, and they just smashed, smash, without warning. Masked, unmasked, people came in and just wreaked havoc every which way. And as you can see, it wasn't confined to young men. There were young women there as well, celebrating this as a victory for the state of Israel. Screaming, crowds marching through the streets, screaming, Mavet la'Aravim, death to the Arabs. Sheisaref lachem akfar, may your village burn. Ma ratzitem la'asig? Yatzanu la'archovot. What was your goal? We came to fight with the Arabs. We're now looking at a pogrom that's being live streamed in real time. This is our new reality, live streaming pogroms. Im tzarich gam nahorog otam. If needed, we'll kill them. If needed, we'll murder them. This is Israel's national broadcaster interviewing him on live TV. They ask, "Are you Arab? Are you Arab or not?" And once they get the answer, they would stop cars in the middle of the street, any passing car. And of course, it's impossible to tell a Jew from a Palestinian in most cases, because half of the Jews in Israel are themselves Arab Jews, or from Middle Eastern countries. So you can't tell straight off the block. So you ask a question to hear their response. Are you Arab? And once the answer is clear that maybe you're not Jewish, that's when they attack. And they pull people out of their cars, and they go to work on them. And they beat them, and they beat them, and they beat them. And they kick them, and they punch them with sticks, and with poles, and with flags, until they're bloody, and they're bleeding, and until they're lifeless, and not moving. And in the end, they chant, Am Yisrael Chai, the Jewish nation lives. And the next day, the sun rises, and back to normal, as if we didn't just witness a live stream pogrom. This is our new reality. This was not some small town in the middle of nowhere. This is in the heart of the Israeli metropole. Now, the last thing I'll say, just to bring you up to date, to understand how far gone we really are in this country. It's not just that you can see a street named after Kahana. It's not just that you can mail letters with a stamp of Kahana. It's not only the right. It's mainstream. It's the middle. It's the center. It's all the Israeli news outlets and media sites that give him the platform, that give the Kahanists open mics. I mean, statistically, maybe the prime minister gets more airtime. After that, it's the Kahanist Ben Gvir who gets the most invitations to come speak on the panels. He's the one who gets the platform that's the largest of all the Israeli politicians, if you can imagine that. He's the most popular. And it's not only the Likud, it's Labor as well, I'm sad to say. So, and this is the last sentence I'll say to take you out. A decade ago, this is again in the heart of Tel Aviv, at Tel Aviv Central Bus Station, the Kahanists set up a display, and they thought, we're gonna have a referendum, they said. And this referendum, we're asking passersby to vote. Do you believe that Kahana was right, or do you believe that Rabin was right? Is it right to ethnically cleanse Palestinians, or is it right to make peace with them? All the problematic nature of the Oslo Accords, but in concept, was Kahana right or was Rabin right? Now, I don't think the question was settled at Tel Aviv Central Station, but it was later settled by Israel's president in recent months, because you would think that after all, Rabin was the head of the Labor Party, right? The Labor or the left-wing nationalists, right? So you'd think that the current Israeli president, who himself was the head of the Labor Party, who was allegedly the head of the opposition to Netanyahu for years, that he would quite clearly choose Rabin, whose path should be followed. But since Herzog was elected Israeli president in recent months, after a quarter century of the Israeli government holding a memorial service every year on the anniversary of Rabin's death at the site where he was assassinated in front of Tel Aviv City Hall. After 25 years, no longer. This year, it stopped. Instead, Herzog, who as opposition leader backed every move Netanyahu made over the last decade, Herzog, now that he's prime minister, they don't any longer do those memorial services to Rabin in Rabin Square named after him. Instead, Herzog goes down to Khalil. He goes down to Hebron, to the site of the massacre, and he lights candles with the Kahanist community there. And I'm not saying that in a flippant way. Here is Herzog himself with this man, this rabbi. Who is this rabbi that he's so proudly aligning himself with? None other than Eliezer Melamed, the very rabbi that initiated the whole process of Rabin's assassination, when he sent a letter to hundreds of Israeli rabbis asking them, is Rabin deserving of death? Maybe we need to discuss this. Maybe we need to mete out a death sentence to Rabin. Discuss, debate. He launched that process as the Eliezer Melamed. Decades ago, he was considered far right and fringe. Today, he's celebrated by Israel's labor left-wing president. This is the reality that we're living in. This is why I say that these are no longer separate entities, that Israel has now become Kahanistan. I don't have any more words. That's it.